What would you do if, just days before your wedding, you were handed a contract that stripped away your independence and demanded you surrender everything you had built? Would you sign quietly for the sake of appearances, or would you rise and defend your worth? Isabella Reed never imagined she would be faced with such a choice. At 30 years old, she was not just any woman preparing to walk down the aisle. She was a New York-based interior architect who had clawed her way from nothing to build a boutique design firm valued at $12 million. Every achievement, every client, every detail of her career was the result of her vision, grit, and persistence. But Isabella had chosen to keep her success hidden. To most people, she was simply a talented designer, humble and dedicated to her craft. She never flaunted her wealth or her position. She wanted people to see her for who she was, not for the balance in her accounts. She wanted love that was genuine, recognition that was real, and respect that came from her work, not from her net worth. And yet, just when she thought she had found all of that, an ultimatum shattered her world. Days away from the wedding she had dreamed of, Isabella discovered that true tests of love and loyalty do not happen at the altar, they happen in the contracts meant to silence you. 3 days before the wedding, the world Isabella Reed thought she had carefully built was shaken to its core. The Whitmores, one of Chicago's most established families, whose reputation stretched across generations of wealth and influence, summoned her to a private meeting. Sitting across the table were Charles and Margaret Whitmore, her fiancé's parents, their expressions sharp with calculation rather than warmth. In their hands lay a document, pristine in presentation but ruthless in intent. It was a prenuptial agreement, written with no trace of balance or fairness. The terms demanded that Isabella relinquish every financial right should the marriage dissolve, not only to her personal wealth, but also to the intellectual property that formed the very foundation of her design firm. Her years of building a company from scratch, her award-winning concepts, her unique architectural blueprints, all of it would belong to another if the Whitmores had their way. To them, Isabella's vision was not a legacy but leverage. The insult cut deeper than the legal jargon. Charles and Margaret made their stance clear. They believed she had attached herself to their son not out of love, but out of ambition. To them, she was a woman of modest background climbing too high, seeking a place she had not earned. No recognition of her achievements, no acknowledgement of a company she had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Just suspicion wrapped in formality, sealed with the cold arrogance of privilege. The ultimatum was simple yet devastating. Sign by 9 o'clock the next morning, or the wedding, planned with months of detail and anticipation, would be cancelled. It was not a request. It was a command disguised as protection, meant to corner her into compliance. That night, Isabella sat in silence, her heart torn between love and betrayal. The weight of injustice pressed against her, but her resolve was stronger. She had fought too hard to carve her name into the industry, too long to allow it to be erased by signatures on a page. Though hurt, she knew surrender was not an option. The Whitmores had underestimated her, mistaking humility for weakness. But Isabella was not a woman who bowed to power, she was one who built it. Isabella wasted no time after leaving the Whitmores' imposing estate. Her first call was to Maya Lopez, her closest confidant, and the one person who had witnessed every step of her climb from obscurity to success. Within the hour, Maya arrived with Daniel Harper, a seasoned attorney known for dismantling unfair contracts. Together, the three pored over the document, every clause more invasive than the last. Daniel's professional detachment could not mask his disdain. This was not protection, but a carefully engineered trap designed to strip Isabella of everything she had built. As Isabella listened to his explanation, the truth became undeniable. This was no longer about love or even family dynamics. It was a calculated assault on her career, a move to ensure that her intellectual property, her company, and her years of labor would be absorbed into the Whitmores' vast empire. The prenup was a weapon, not a safeguard, meant to reduce her identity to dependency. For the first time, Isabella allowed herself to feel the full weight of their suspicion, and it ignited something sharper than pain resolve. That evening, Isabella met Adrian for a private dinner. Away from the pressure of his family's expectations, she finally revealed the truth she had guarded for years. Her net worth exceeded $12 million, a fortune built not from inheritance but from her creativity, strategy, and relentless determination. She confessed that her secrecy had not been deception but protection, an effort to be valued for who she was, not for what she owned. The revelation left Adrian stunned. The man who had always believed he held financial security over her was now confronted with a reality he had never imagined. For a moment, he was silent, wrestling with the dual shock of her hidden success and the injustice his family had placed before her. When he spoke, his words carried sincerity, if not certainty. He admired her strength, respected her decision, and admitted his own frustration with his parents' control. Yet, beneath his support, a quiet hesitation remained. Adrian confessed he had never truly stood against his family, never challenged the power they wielded. He wanted to believe love was enough, but he lacked the courage to defy those who had shaped his world. For Isabella, his admission was bittersweet. She felt seen, perhaps for the first time in days, yet also realized the path ahead was hers to walk. Adrian's sympathy mattered, but it could not shield her. The choice to fight for her worth was hers alone. With the dawn of a new day, Isabella refused to remain a passive participant in her own future. Sitting across from Daniel Harper in his office, she leaned into strategy rather than fear. Together, they drafted an alternative prenuptial agreement, one that safeguarded her assets, protected the originality of her designs, and acknowledged her as a co-builder of marital property rather than a dependent beneficiary. Every clause in this new document was crafted with precision, not as a wall to separate her from Adrian, but as a foundation for mutual respect. Later, Isabella met with Adrian to present the plan. The conversation was charged but steady. Adrian listened carefully, his initial apprehension giving way to admiration for her clarity. He agreed to stand with her, not against his family in open rebellion, but alongside her in fairness. They made a pact. If the Whitmores refused to accept these terms, they would forego the lavish wedding entirely. Instead, they would marry on their own terms, a smaller ceremony where vows meant more than spectacle, and love was not overshadowed by the influence of wealth. For the first time, Adrian spoke with a conviction that reassured Isabella. He would no longer allow silence to be mistaken for compliance. That night, Isabella found herself alone in her studio, surrounded by sketches pinned across the walls, fragments of the empire she had built. She traced the lines of her earliest drawings, remembering the years of sacrifice, 16-hour days spent drafting, nights curled up on a studio sofa, surviving on little more than coffee and determination. Each piece was a reminder of how far she had come without anyone's permission. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, steady and unwavering. If no one else recognizes your worth, you must recognize it yourself. The reflection steeled her spirit. What the Whitmores framed as arrogance was, in truth, the integrity she had cultivated through years of labor. She realized this confrontation was not just about marriage or business, it was about defining who she was and refusing to let others rewrite her narrative. With a plan set in motion, Isabella understood the days ahead would test her, but she was no longer afraid of the test. She was ready to defend her identity, her love, and the empire she had built with her own two hands. The meeting at the lake house carried the weight of Judgment Day. A quiet tension filled the air as Isabella and Adrian arrived, documents in hand, stepping into what felt less like a dinner and more like a tribunal. The restaurant, chosen as neutral ground, was elegant but cold, the polished wood and dim lighting amplifying the gravity of what was about to unfold. Across the table sat Charles and Margaret Whitmore, regal in posture yet unyielding in their scrutiny, as though the very act of being summoned to discuss terms was beneath them. Isabella began with poise. She laid out the revised prenuptial agreement and the accompanying financial disclosures, every line transparent, every figure exact. There was no hesitation in her voice as she explained that this version safeguarded both parties, honoring the integrity of their union rather than protecting one family's dominance. For every attempt the Whitmores had made to paint her as opportunistic, she countered with evidence of her independence and success. Then, in a moment that pierced the silence, she revealed the truth of her wealth, not as a boast, but as a statement of fact. She reminded them that she had built her fortune brick by brick, design by design, long before Adrian entered her life. Her words were steady, but her eyes carried a fire that could not be extinguished. "I do not need the Whitmore name to hold value," she said. "I am here because I love Adrian, not because I require anyone's fortune." Charles shifted uncomfortably, the mask of control faltering. He had expected resistance, but not the irrefutable proof of Isabella's independence. Margaret, ever the arbiter of social hierarchies, maintained her hauteur, but even her dismissive silence betrayed a crack in her armor. Their narrative of Isabella as a social climber collapsed under the weight of her transparency. Adrian, who had once stood in the shadow of his parents' authority, now found his voice. With a resolve that startled even himself, he declared his allegiance to Isabella. If she was not recognized as an equal partner, there would be no ceremony, no union sanctioned by the Whitmore legacy. His words were neither dramatic nor impulsive. They were deliberate, an unshakable line in the sand. The atmosphere shifted. For the first time, the balance of power tilted away from the Whitmores. What began as an ambush had become a reckoning, one where Isabella stood tall and unshaken, her strength matched by Adrian's solidarity. Charles and Margaret, once certain of their dominance, found themselves forced into contemplation. The certainty they had wielded for decades faltered in the face of a woman who refused to be diminished and a son who had finally chosen conviction over compliance. In that moment, Isabella understood she had already won, not by outmaneuvering them, but by refusing to bow. The decision now lay with the Whitmores, but the control was no longer theirs alone. The morning after the confrontation at the lake house, the tone of everything had shifted. The revised prenuptial agreement, once dismissed as impossible, now lay on the table between both families, its pages marked by only a few modest adjustments. Where once there had been secrecy and imbalance, there was now clarity and fairness. Signatures were added without protest, though each stroke of a pen carried with it the quiet acknowledgment that a new order had been set. Isabella was no longer an outsider to be tested. She had established herself as a partner to be respected. The wedding followed soon after, intimate and glowing with authenticity rather than spectacle. In place of grandeur designed to impress, the atmosphere reflected warmth, sincerity, and love. Guests gathered not as witnesses to a business alliance, but as participants in a union forged by choice. Isabella walked down the aisle in a gown of her own making, each seam and fold representing nights spent sketching, sewing, and dreaming. It was more than fabric. It was a declaration of self-reliance, of artistry, and of identity. What no one had anticipated was Margaret's gesture. With deliberate grace, she unclasped the sapphire necklace that had belonged to Whitmore women for generations and placed it around Isabella's neck. It was not merely an accessory, but an acknowledgment that battles had been fought and bridges, though fragile, had been built. The necklace was less a surrender than an unspoken truce, a symbol that while respect could not be demanded, it could be earned. Adrian and Isabella began their life together in New York, choosing independence over inherited security. Their home was filled with the quiet strength of two people who had defined their own terms, who had drawn boundaries where necessary, yet still left room for reconciliation where it was deserved. They moved forward with the knowledge that marriage, like any creation, required patience, trust, and shared vision. The story did not end in triumph over an enemy, but in victory over fear. Isabella's greatest achievement was not the prenup, not even the wedding, but the affirmation that her value could never again be dictated by anyone else's name or status. And from this story emerges a lesson that reaches beyond wealth or lineage. True worth lies not in titles or possessions, but in the courage to claim one's dignity. In marriage, equality cannot be enforced through coercion or tradition. It must be nurtured through respect, recognition, and the willingness to stand side by side as equals. The question, left lingering as the story closes, is one that challenges every listener to look inward. When faced with a choice between comfort and silence and strength and truth, would you sign for peace or rise to demand fairness?